Is it worth the risk to keep on going?
Sure, to win. I mean, that's what we've always done. The money's never been a factor. We raced when we didn't have any.
He was called the Intimidator for a reason. With 76 wins, millions in prize money, and a legacy carved into the asphalt of Daytona, Dale Earnhardt Sr. was more than just a driver. He was a symbol of fearless control, unshakable grit, and Southern motorsport royalty. But on February 18, 2001, all of that ended in a single jarring moment. What looked like just another bump in the final lap turned out to be the crash that silenced a legend and shook NASCAR to its core. What followed was heartbreaking. The final lap, what really happened at Daytona, he had been here before. Same track, same roar of the crowd, same tight turns at terrifying speed. Daytona was Dale Earnhardt's cathedral. He knew every inch of its high banks and long straights. He had dominated it, bled on it, and raised trophies above its finish line. And on that February afternoon, he was not leading the race, but he was doing something just as important. He was protecting it. In the final lap of the 2001 Daytona 500, Dale Earnhardt Sr. was holding back the pack. His son, Dale Earnhardt Jr., and his driver, Michael Waltrip, were up front, fighting for the win. Dale Sr. was behind them, using his car like a bodyguard, blocking, sliding, defending the inside line. It was a calculated, deliberate move. He was not just racing for himself anymore. He was playing team captain in a high-speed chess match where one mistake meant disaster. Then it happened. As they entered Turn 4, with the checkered flag seconds away, Sterling Marlin's car crept into Earnhardt's rear quarter panel. It was not violent. It was the kind of contact that happened dozens of times a race. But at 150 miles per hour, even a gentle nudge can be lethal. Earnhardt's car veered down slightly, then snapped upward toward the wall. Ken Schrader's car came up beside him. The two vehicles collided, and Dale's number 3 Chevrolet slammed head first into the outside barrier. It did not look catastrophic. Not at first. The car hit the wall and skidded to a stop. There was no fire, no dramatic spin, no explosion of parts. It was a crash, but nothing that would make fans in the stands gasp in horror. If anything, it looked survivable. The kind of wreck Dale had walked away from 100 times before. But this time was different. Ken Schrader was the first person to reach him. He climbed out of his own wrecked vehicle and rushed to the driver's side of a number 3 car. What he saw made him back away almost immediately. His face changed. His posture dropped. He later told reporters he would not describe what he had seen, not because he wanted to protect Dale, but because he knew he had just looked at death. Medical crews arrived quickly. They pulled Earnhardt from the wreckage and rushed him to Halifax Medical Center. The world waited. Fans stood in silence. Pit crews stopped moving. Broadcasters, usually talkative and excited at race's end, spoke in hushed tones. They did not know it yet, but NASCAR had just changed forever. At 5:16 p.m., doctors confirmed what many already feared. Dale Earnhardt Sr. was dead, slain instantly by the impact. The man who had seemed indestructible, who had built his reputation on intimidation and daring, was gone. But how? How could such a minor-looking crash slay the most experienced driver on the track? That is what the autopsy would reveal. And what it uncovered left fans in shock. The autopsy report, released by the Volusia County Medical Examiner, confirmed that Earnhardt died of a basilar skull fracture. This type of injury is a severe break at the base of the skull, often involving the area around the brainstem. It is among the most lethal types of head trauma, and is typically caused by sudden, violent deceleration, exactly what happened when Earnhardt's car hit the wall at high speed. The crash itself lasted mere seconds, but the forces involved were enormous. The fracture was described as a ring fracture circling the base of the skull. This kind of injury causes instantaneous loss of brain function. In layman's terms, Dale Earnhardt died the moment his head whipped forward and then violently snapped back during the impact. It was fast, silent, final. There was no pain, no awareness, just sudden, irreversible stillness. Additional findings from the autopsy revealed blunt force trauma to the chest, fractured ribs, a broken left ankle, and abrasions from the seatbelt. There were rumors that the seatbelt had failed, which circulated quickly in the immediate aftermath. Some speculated it had been altered before the race. Others believed it had torn on impact, but those rumors were disputed by medical personnel and team members. Tommy Probst, a rescue worker who tried to save Earnhardt's life, publicly stated that the seatbelt remained intact when he arrived at the scene. Regardless, the result was the same. The head trauma alone was sufficient to be fatal. The lack of a head and neck support device. The Hans device played a significant role. At the time, the device was not mandatory in NASCAR, and Earnhardt had refused to wear one, believing it limited his mobility. Other drivers shared his opinion. That changed overnight. NASCAR began an internal review almost immediately. Within days, the organization was examining crash footage, inspecting car components, and consulting medical experts to understand exactly how one of the sport's greatest legends had died in what looked like a survivable crash. What they found was damning. The cars were too rigid. The walls were too hard. The safety gear was outdated. It was a brutal awakening for a sport that had prioritized speed and spectacle for decades. Earnhardt's death made one thing painfully clear. Something had to change. And it did. New safety standards were introduced within the year. The Hans device became mandatory. Car interiors were redesigned to improve energy absorption. Crash walls were rebuilt using safer barriers, steel and foam energy reduction panels that absorbed kinetic force and reduced blunt impact trauma. Cockpits were reinforced. Helmets evolved. Even the seats were upgraded to cradle the driver's head and shoulders more securely. Dale Earnhardt's death did not just mark the end of an era. It sparked the beginning of a revolution. And while nothing could bring him back, every driver who has walked away from a crash since owes a debt to the legacy he left behind. Not just on the track, but in the pages of an autopsy report that rewrote the rulebook. As news of his passing spread, tributes poured in from around the globe. Fans wept openly at Daytona. Fellow racers wore black armbands. His iconic number 3 car became a symbol of loss and respect. There were no more questions about his toughness, no more doubts about his commitment. The man who once said he would rather die in a race car than fade away quietly had done exactly that. And in doing so, he left behind a blueprint that might just have saved hundreds of lives since. But for those who were there that day, especially his son, Dale Earnhardt Jr., the pain was not philosophical. It was personal. Watching your father die in front of you at 200 miles per hour is not something you ever forget. For Jr., the grief turned into motivation. He carried the Earnhardt name into a new generation of racing, winning races, earning the title of most popular driver year after year, and advocating for safer racing conditions along the way. There is something haunting about the way Dale Earnhardt died, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet, sudden, almost invisible to the untrained eye. No smoke, no flames, just a man who had been through everything the sport could throw at him, undone by a single perfect storm of physics and fate. And maybe that is why the world remembers it so clearly, because if it can happen to him, it can happen to anyone. How one death reshaped an entire sport the moment Dale Earnhardt Sr.'s death was confirmed. Something shifted in the culture of NASCAR. It was not just mourning, it was reckoning. For decades, the sport had walked a razor-thin line between thrilling spectacle and mortal danger. Accidents were expected. Crashes were part of the entertainment. But the death of the Intimidator was different. It was not just the loss of a legend. It was a call to arms. Within hours, NASCAR executives launched a full internal investigation. Every frame of race footage was rewatched. Every mechanical component of Earnhardt's number 3 Chevrolet was examined. Medical records, car telemetry, even seatbelt fragments were scrutinized. Nothing was off limits. There was a growing realization that if Earnhardt could die in what appeared to be a moderate crash, then something fundamental was broken, and that something had to be fixed. What they found was unsettling. The cars had evolved to become faster, stiffer, and more aerodynamic. But in doing so, they had become more dangerous in a crash. The same rigidity that made a car cut through air also made it transfer more force to the driver in an impact. It was like being inside a missile made of steel and fiberglass. Then there were the walls, concrete, unforgiving, and everywhere. When a driver hit them, all the force was reflected inward. The track at Daytona was designed for speed, not for survival. Earnhardt hit Turn 4's outside wall at an angle that funneled every ounce of kinetic energy straight into the cockpit. That energy had nowhere to go, and the result was fatal. The response was immediate. NASCAR formed the Research and Development Center, a dedicated facility whose sole purpose was to improve driver safety. They began consulting with biomechanical engineers, trauma surgeons, and crash specialists. Racing could no longer afford to treat injuries as unfortunate side effects. Prevention had to become a priority. The first breakthrough was in restraint systems. Within months, the Hans device was no longer optional. This head and neck support system anchored the driver's helmet to the shoulders, preventing the deadly whiplash that caused Earnhardt's skull fracture. The very motion that slain him would now be physically impossible for future drivers wearing the device. Then came the safer barrier. The steel and foam energy reduction system replaced bare concrete walls with layered materials that absorbed and dispersed energy. Developed by engineers at the University of Nebraska, these barriers acted like shock absorbers, reducing crash forces by up to 70%. They were first installed at Indianapolis, then quickly spread across every major NASCAR venue. The cars themselves underwent radical change. The car of tomorrow, introduced in 2007, featured a wider frame, reinforced roof, and energy-absorbing materials in the cockpit. The driver was repositioned further from the door to reduce the risk of side impact trauma. Roof flaps were redesigned. Roll cages were upgraded. Every inch of the vehicle was reimagined with one question in mind: how we keep the next Dale Earnhardt from dying. Public reaction was mixed. Longtime fans feared the sport would become overregulated, too sanitized, too slow. Some even accused NASCAR of exploiting Earnhardt's death to justify commercial redesigns. But most understood what was at stake. The loss of one of the greatest drivers of all time could not be for nothing. If Dale Earnhardt had to die, then the least the sport could do was learn from it. Drivers embraced the changes, some reluctantly at first. Many had resisted the Hans device, complaining it was uncomfortable or restrictive. But after seeing what happened on that February afternoon, resistance vanished. No one wanted to be the next autopsy report. Crew chiefs, engineers, and even pit crews began training differently. Safety drills became standard. Crash simulations were analyzed in detail. The era of flying by instinct was over.